Review. So to start with, we have this first question. This is just doing reference counting in your head, something you typically don't have to worry too much about in Swift because it does it automatically, but it is good to know because if you know how to reference count, then you know how to check for strong reference cycles. So basically we go through here, the message instance that gets created, when we assign it to my message, its reference count goes up to 1. Then when we assign the other message constant to also have another reference to the same instance, then its reference count goes up by 2. When we pass it to the function display, its reference count goes up to 3. And then when you leave the display scope, because you've left the scope and that reference isn't held anymore, the reference count comes back down to 2 by the time we get to print my message. Any questions about that one before I move on to the next? Cool. So this one, it's a lot of code, but you might recognize that this is a pretty common error pattern. This is a strong reference cycle. This occurs when you have one class that retains a strong reference to another class. I say class, you could also say reference type, but so far you only really know of like closures and classes as reference types. So here, the main thing to know that's kind of interesting about this question is that the strong references that printer holds to the text instance are inside of an array, and an array is a value type. So you might expect that there being a value type in between could break the cycle. It does not, because a value type passes by copy, but it's still holding a reference, a strong reference, then wherever you pass that copy around is now holding a strong reference. So every time you reuse it or duplicate it, if you're passing by value, then you're increasing your reference count by 1. Basically, think of strong references and your reference count to be tied more to the fact that you are a reference type, or not you, but anything that refers to a reference type, which is a class or a closure, right, basically increases the reference count by 1, no matter what it is that's holding that reference, be it a value type, be it anything. The only exception is if you mark it as weak or unowned. If that reference is marked as weak or unowned, it does not increase the reference count for that instance. And that's the only way to keep the reference count from going up whenever you refer to something. So that's the solution. You use weak var. Any questions about strong reference cycles before we move on? Cool. Okay. This one is just vocabulary, basically. I kind of hated these questions when I was a student. I'm sure you all do too. But I find that as I'm teaching the material, it's very important to make sure that we are using the same terms to mean the same thing. So I'm mostly checking to see if I'm teaching you the terms correctly so that you can understand the concepts correctly. Because if I'm using the wrong words, then you might not understand what I'm saying. So that's kind of what this question is about pretty much. But we'll quickly go through it. The function here in the extension, this is a default implementation for the protocol content. The associated type content type is surprisingly an associated type. The var ID string get is a property requirement. It is a requirement that this protocol requires for any implementer, for anyone that adopts it to conform. Apologies again, I said implementers. I'll get over that eventually. The function in the protocol, that is here, this line. I realize that's kind of a confusing phrasing. I should have had line numbers, I think, for this question. Sorry. But the function here in the protocol is the mutating method requirement. And then, because this is a requirement for a mutating method for anyone who implements content. And then struct video content is this line right here. it's declaring protocol adoption. So it's saying, I will adopt this protocol and I promise to conform to it. Yeah, so that's that. Any questions about these terms before we move on? Okay, right, I should leave that up. This one here, sorry, I have to the angling in this room is completely different. I have to walk out here so I can see the questions. Here we call update with on an instance of a type that has conformed to the content protocol. So basically, episode is a constant or a variable of some type that has conformed to the protocol. That's what you're given. Now, given this call, what is the type of the content type for this instance and why? We know that content type is the associated type or an associated type for the content type protocol, for the content protocol. And that's basically a generic, which means for every instance of that protocol, it can be different. In this case, it's URL because we're passing in a URL to this function, and this function's parameter, new content, requires that it is a type of content type, and content type is our associated type. So we know that our content type for this is URL, assuming that it compiles, which we are. So, cool. Any questions about that? Alrighty. This one is about the video struct here, and why does the below error show up and how would you fix it? I apologize. I thought I'd edited this to be a little bit less Swifty and have a get in it, but I didn't. So this one, I have a lot of explanations for, I think, the incorrect answers, so we won't go into it too much, but the main thing to note here is that the title property requirement requires that you be able to both get and set that property for anyone who adopts this protocol. Video adopts the protocol content, and in order to conform to it, title needs to have an ability to be get and set. So title needs to either be a stored property that is accessible for setting, or it needs to have a setter as a computed property. So it needs to have a get and a set. Any questions about this one? Okay. Yeah. What was the question? Sorry? Third one. Content property does not conform to the content property requirement. Content type has not had its type explicitly declared. So this one you don't need to do because Swift is very, very good at figuring out what your associated types and what your generic type parameters are. So by lieu of the fact that we declare content as video data, this type, which is not in here, it's some type elsewhere from the API or wherever, right? So this type right here gets inferred by the compiler to be what we're setting for content type. If this protocol did not have var content type as a requirement, and we didn't have to have this here, then Swift has no contextual information to figure out what the content type is. Therefore, you would need to include the type alias content type equals video data. But because we have something here that gives Swift a hint as to what it should be, it then infers that. And if you ever have conflicts, like if you were to implement the mutating function, for example, ignoring the default implementation, and you would have its content type, you would maybe pass in a string instead in your implementation, then those two types, the string and video data, would not be the same, and you'd get a compiler error. So they have to be the same. Does that answer the question? Perfect. Cool. All right, and then the last one here is thinking about creating a global function. 3 requirements are given. You need to have the same concrete type coming in, 2 of them. You need to return the same type as was passed in, and the type that the type of the 2 parameters passed in that must be the same also needs to conform to collection. So collection is a protocol provided by Foundation. So basically here the options, I need to scroll further. Oh, I can't. Oh man, I hate that. I always love to center things, you know? Basically here, we've got a bunch of really interesting options that kind of do what we're looking for, but they miss one or two of the requirements each. So the main thing to know is that generics, strict generics, and just using generic types specifically instead of also using any protocol or some protocol is how you get this kind of strict adherence of the two things that come in must be the exact same type, and the return type of the function is also the same type as the two things that were passed in. When you do something like any collection getting passed in for both of them, what ends up happening is you could pass in two different types that implement conform to collection, right? So you could pass in a string, which is a collection of characters, and an array of integers, which is also a collection, right? And their types won't match up. Or maybe more dangerously, you could pass in an array of integers and an array of doubles, which might look like it should work, but it should not for our requirements that have been stated here. So, yeah, so stuff like that. Any questions about this one before we finish the quiz review, take a 5-minute break, and then dive into lecture today? Dope. Cool. All right, I will see you all in 5 minutes. I mean, I'll see you in the meantime if you stick around, but if you need to go to the bathroom or whatever.